Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim daf Kafchet. Today's daf is sponsored by Martin Gaynor in loving memory of Dr. Jerry Rabbanit Zichrono Lebracha. Today's daf is sponsored by Tova and David Kestenbaum in loving memory of their dear aunt Esther Press. Esther Fagel Bat Raphael Ze'ed V'Chaya Chasha. She was a role model of a life of Torah and Chesed. She cared so much about family, and we all felt very close to her. Okay, we're going to now get started back to our Mishna. Okay, this is a good example of needing to have a little bit of patience when we learn Gemara and not to jump to conclusions when we first start learning something until we get to the continuation. I saw a Facebook post yesterday about someone who was complaining about the Mishna and saying, how could the Mishna tell us that it's okay to lie about paying taxes, right? Which obviously could lead to dangerous conclusions. As we know, all sorts of issues of tax evasion, and then couch it in, oh, well, the Mishna says it's okay. So to which I responded, well, wait till tomorrow. So we're going to read now and try to understand this seemingly bizarre Mishna. Nedarim laharagim, we're going to start from the beginning again. Nedarim laharagim lecharamim ulemochsin shehi truma, af al pi she'ena truma. She'en shel Beit HaMelech, af al pi she'enan shel Beit HaMelech. So we allow you to take a neder, a vow. That's basically a lie, saying that something is, we're going to get to exactly what's the language of this vow and how does this work. We'll get to that in the Gemara. But you can take a vow, vowing that something is truma, even if it's not, so that the tax collectors don't, or a robber or a murderer doesn't take it, right? Again, we talked about this interestingly, how the murderer or the tax collector would care that it was truma, but wouldn't care that they're stealing it from you or taking it from you, or claiming that it's the king's property. Now we'll get back to this issue. How is this possible? This could be the first question of Gemara. How could we possibly lie when it comes to taxes, right? Maybe a thief, maybe a murderer, but taxes, that seems strange. To which we're going to have now three, we'll get back to that in a minute when we get to the Gemara, but now we're going to have three debates between Beit Shamai and Beit Hillel about this Mishna. First machloket, Beit Shamai omrim, bakol nodrim, chutz mi b'shvuah. Ubeit Hillel omrim af b'shvuah. You can even take an oath according to Beit Hillel. Not only a neder, we've seen all along. Again, there's certain ways that neder is more strict than shvuah, that a vow is more strict than oath, but generally we view an oath more seriously. Often it's in the name of God. So Beit Shammai says, shvuah, you could do the same thing. Beit Hillel says. Beit Shammai says, no, only a vow, not an oath. Beit Shammai omrim, lo yiftach lo b'neder. When it comes to the neder and a vow is okay, Beit Shammai says, but you can't initiate. Okay, until now we've always used petach as trying to undo your vow using a petach, right? We have an opening, we give you some way to get out of it. In this case, we're talking about something different. Yiftach means to initiate. Lo yiftach lo b'neder means, let's say someone's standing there going to steal your stuff, and you say, I'm not going to, you say this is truma. You can't immediately start saying, I vow this is truma, however the vow is going to work. We'll get to it in a minute, but make a vow about it being truma. But you start with, this is truma. If they're not going to believe you and they insist that you take a vow and they say, I don't believe you that it's truma, vow, then you can do it. Only if they initiate and not you. That's what it means. Lo yiftach lo b'neder. You can't start with that. Ubeit Hillel omrim af yiftach lo. Beit Hillel says no problem. You can start right away. They put a gun to your head, they want your stuff. You say, this is truma with a neder, without a problem, even before they start telling you you need a vow about it. Third machloket, Beit Shammai omrim, b'ma shehu mediro. You can only take a vow on what they want you to take a vow about. Beit Hillel omrim, af b'ma she'ena mediro. Even if you add something else that they didn't ask you. Now, we'll see what this means in a second, so maybe I shouldn't even explain it, but basically, your vow is not really a vow. In other words, the whole concept here is if I took a vow, this vow, I don't have to keep my vow. And comes Beit Hillel and says, if you added other things beyond what they requested you vow about, which we'll explain in a minute, then you don't have to keep any of it. Whereas Beit Shammai says you only don't keep the part that they said, but not the part that you added. So let's read it in the case, and then you'll understand. Ketzad, what's the case? Amarlo, if they said to you, Emor konan ishti neheneli, say, right? You say this is truma. Well, I'm going to make you take a vow and say the following thing. Say, konam, my wife will be konam to me. She'll be forbidden from benefiting from me. If this is truma, right? If this is not truma, you would say, right? Basically, that's saying this is the way you have a vow. I vow that it's truma by saying my wife will be forbidden to me if this is truma. If this is not truma. So now what happened? Instead of you saying, my wife is vowed to me, blah, 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 like the guy wanted you to say, or your husband, or whatever it might be. Instead, you added not just your spouse, but you added your children as well. But this person never told you, take a vow about your children. So the Mishna tells us the vow you took is not a vow. You don't have to keep to it, okay? If you say, if this isn't truma, my spouse will be forbidden to me, and it turns out it really wasn't truma, your spouse is not forbidden to you. But what if you added also my children? And they didn't tell you to add your children. So that's the machloket. Beit Shamai omrim ishto muteret ubanav asurim. Because you added more than what they asked, well, tough luck. You added something that's not what they asked. You now have to keep that part of the vow. This is very similar to the previous Mishna about, and maybe this is why it's here, neder shu tar miksato, right? If you partially get rid of a vow, part of this vow is irrelevant. Well, the other part still stands according to Beit Shamai. And Beit Hillel, consistent with what they said in the previous Mishnah, Beit Hillel omrim elu ve'elu mutarim. All are permitted because once part of the vow is permitted, the entire vow is permitted. So now, also, it doesn't necessarily have to connect with that machloket. It also is logical. Each one has a logical position. Beit Hillel says, you were just trying to strengthen your case against this person who was either going to kill you or rob you or take taxes from you for no reason. We'll get to what the taxes are exactly. But basically, so you added to stress your point, but you didn't really mean it from the beginning, and we all know that. According to Beit Shamai, they didn't ask you to do that. You added that on your own. That's your own neder. First neder was what you were forced to do. You added your own thing. Well, that's your tough luck. So now the Gemara starts off back to the beginning of the Mishnah. How on earth are we allowed to lie here? So, Hamar Shmuel, dina de malchuta dina. Comes Shmuel and says, very famous line of Shmuel's, he says this. This is quoted in his name. Okay, so if you've heard this concept, dina de malchuta dina, it's all from Shmuel. Shmuel says the law of the land is the law. You have to keep the law of the land. They collect taxes. You have to pay taxes. You can't do tax evasion and claim, oh, well, I don't have to pay taxes. The law of the land is the law. So before we even go on and get to the answer, this is a very famous quote that Shmuel says, and it's open to many different interpretations. So the first thing I want to do is read in the Ran where he quotes Tosfot. If you look at the words b'moches ha'omei me'elav, about 10 lines down, skipping a few words, katvu b'Tosfot. Didafka b'malchei ovdei kochavim amar de dina de malchuta dina. This law of dina de malchuta dina only applies, according to Tosfot and many other commentaries, only applies to Gentile regimes. Why? Here comes his interesting logic. Why is the law of the land the law? Now, if I ask you why is the law of the land the law, right? You might tell me something like, well, the law of the land is a law because laws keep order and we have to keep order. And, there's a certain element of that, even in a non-Jewish government. But that's not what Tosfot says. Tosfot says it's mipnei sha'aretz shelo, because the land belongs to the Gentile authority. Basically, you might get kicked off the land if you don't keep the law of the land. So therefore, keep the law of the land so they don't kick you out. But b'malchei Yisrael, lo. Well, guess what? In Israel, even if theoretically they could kick you out, practically, l'fisha eretz Yisrael, kol Yisrael shutafim ba. We all have joint ownership. Fascinating line over Israel. And therefore, the authorities have no right to kick us out. If they try to kick us out, we can't. It's actually funny. I was having a discussion over dinner last night, and all of a sudden just popped into my head this connection. My daughter was on a bus, and she was schmoozing with the bus driver. And apparently, maybe I shouldn't really publicize this, but apparently in Israel, there's really no good way to check up if people are paying for buses or not. And that, first of all, he said many people take advantage and don't pay, and the bus drivers no longer have jurisdiction to really do so much about it. And even the pakachim, the people who come on, to check, they theoretically, what could they do if you don't pay? You could argue they don't really have the jurisdiction to do anything about it. it's good they're a threat, and people might think they have to pay because they're there. But theoretically, she was explaining to me that they can't, I forget exactly, but they're not the police, right? They're not the police. Only the police could really do anything. Police have jurisdiction and they can theoretically call the police, but they're on a bus and the bus is moving. How exactly do you call the police? So basically, there's really no way to enforce it. So that's what they're saying here. Theoretically, they can threaten to kick you out of the land, but they can't really kick you out. Okay, practically speaking, they don't have the option to do it because it's not theirs to kick you out. Okay, so basically, according to Tosfot and a bunch of other authorities, this concept of dina dina does not apply to Israel, which is fascinating. The Rambam basically and others say, no, this applies in Israel as well. This applies everywhere. The law of the land is the law, and they have a different approach to it. So number one, yes, I did say this is a little dangerous to say this online, but yeah. Anyway, you should pay your buses because you should pay your buses. This has, by the way, that would fall into the Rambam, dina dina. In other words, it can't be enforced, but it doesn't mean you should be doing it. So I don't want anyone to misquote me on that. But it was this interesting concept about, where what I was trying to point out is this concept that you can't always enforce things, right? They can't theoretically, this concept, according to Tosfot anyway, that no one can ever kick you out of Israel if you're right, because if you're Jewish, because all Jews have rights to land. That's a whole other discussion, right? Get into, who is a Jew and trying to get citizenship in this country. Okay, now the first question of dina dina that all the commentaries discuss is, did this apply only to Gentile regimes or also to Jewish regimes? And by the way, that would only apply to Jewish regimes in Israel. Like, let's say the Uganda proposal went through and we had a Jewish regime in Uganda, that would be different. Then you would have to, theoretically, they could kick you out there. The second issue becomes, to what extent does dina dina apply? To all laws? What if, right? So number one, we have to pick categories of laws. So for example, taxes definitely falls under there. That's clear from the sugya. What other categories fall into here is a good question. That's also a debatable subject. That's question number two, like which laws of the country are considered laws that we absolutely must follow. Issue number three, which is clearly influenced by history, which is what happens when laws either go against Torah law. That's an issue, right? If it goes against the Torah, like they say, you can't do Brit Milad, you have to keep that, right? That's something we've seen in the Gemara. It happens, it's happened over the course of history many times. We're not allowed to keep mitzvot and things like that, or, go against mitzvot or off. So number one, when it goes against the Torah, and number two, when the law, right, when it crosses the line of being a fair law and an unfair law, right? And that obviously opens a Pandora's box into, right, what laws do you have to keep? There's commentaries who say if the king makes up his own laws, those you don't have to keep, and that was clearly influenced by where they were living and what kind of laws were in the country where they were living and how fair or unfair were the laws. And, we all know, right? So let's say in Germany in the 30s, do we have to keep those laws, right? Those are laws that were clearly unfair to Jews and going against Jews, right? So there's a whole debate about what laws are included, and it's sort of those two issues go together, which types of laws, and even within those laws, if it goes beyond a certain, right, where do we draw the line? And it could be they limited it to certain types of laws because of the unfairness of the regimes that were instituting laws that were totally unfair to Jews. So anyway, very interesting topic. Now we're really that was just the question that Shmuel said, so how can we lie about taxes? To which Amar Rav Chinina, Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Shmuel, b'mochet she'en lo kitzba. First answer is in the name of Shmuel also, by the way, which is a tax authority comes to collect and there's no limit. Okay, taxes normally, right? Even if you live in a country, I do with high taxes, right? Still, the high taxes have a limit, right? There's an amount. This is all you have to pay, right? It's not going to be any higher than that. Whereas if they come, there's no limit on what they can take for taxes, that already goes into the realm of this is unfair. And then we allow you to get out of it. Rabbi Yana says this is a tax authority, a tax collector that came by himself. In other words, he's not necessarily representing the government. Okay, this is like a new, you ever have it where there's there's a bridge, let's say. Okay, this probably won't happen nowadays, but it definitely used to happen. There's a bridge and someone decides, I'm going to start charging a tax for anyone who goes over this bridge, right? That's not the government saying it. It's someone who decided this is my territory, or I don't know what, on what rights. They don't really have any rights, and they start charging people for something. So they're basically putting it into the category of unfair practices. And you can read up in Shuli Mishkin's article this week about taxmen. And basically she wrote about all different kinds of tax collections that existed in those days that we can see from the sources that were unfair. In fact, in Sanhedrin comes up that tax collectors actually can't be a witness. That's because they're not believed, because we're obviously talking about tax collectors that are using unfair mechanisms, taking more than they should, right? Like, let's say you're the tax collector in the city, but you decide, oh, you know what, I'm going to take more than I'm supposed to collect from all the people. Okay, so that resolved our first issue of the basics of our Mishnah. How could it possibly be? It seems to go against, besides dina de malchut dina, it goes against what our gut would tell us. How could we possibly lie about taxes? Right? Maybe thief and murderer. That's one thing, but a tax collector, that seems to be something else. But we, in fact, limit it to a tax collector who's more similar to a murderer or a thief, more similar, I would guess, to a thief. Next, so now we're talking about the neder itself. You could have theoretically asked this on the Truma also, but they asked it specifically here, but it's really the same. What exactly is the language of this neder that you're using? Amrav Amram Amarav, ve'omer, if somebody says, Ye'asru perot ha'olam alai, im einam shel Beit HaMelech. If you say, right, it's not like you say, I vow that this is not, I vow that this is truma. That's not a vow. You don't use the language of a vow in that way. A swear, an oath, you could say, I swear this is not, I swear this is truma. A neder has to be some other kind of format. So how would it be? You say, the fruits of the world will be forbidden to me if this is not the king's property. Okay, that basically means if it is the king's property, then I'll be allowed to eat whatever I want. If it's not the king's property, the fruits will be forbidden to me. You're basically taking a vow saying that this is the king's property, but you say it in such a way, if this isn't, and I'm lying, right, which you are actually, but you're kind of pretending that you're not lying. If this is not the king's property, then all the fruits of the world will be forbidden. To which the Gemara says, okay, so if you said that, then really why isn't this neder valid? And it's, by what right do you have to say you can lie and take this neder and then not keep the vow? Kevan de amar yasru, since you said, if these are not the king's possessions, which in fact they're not because you're lying, itasru alei kol perot da'alma, kol perot da'alma. What they're basically saying is the Mishna says you can do this kind of vow and it's not a problem. But the Gemara says, by what method can we say that your vow is not a valid vow? In other words, you basically said the fruits. It's not like you said, I swear these are the fruits. I'm sorry, I swear that these possessions belong to the king. You didn't do that. And then we just say, okay, you're allowed to swear falsely in this way. But you said, if this, then that. And if this was not true, so then that should, they really weren't the kings, in which case they really should be forbidden. So they need to explain by what mechanism does this work? To which they say, but Omer Hayom, what you really said was, and this is telling you, I guess, how you should lie about it. You said, I vow that if these if these possessions are not the king's, which they're really not, all the fruits of the world will be forbidden to me today. And then, okay, so today don't eat fruits. Tomorrow you can eat them. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. The tax collector is not going to believe you because you vowed not to eat fruits today. That's not going to convince him. He's going to say, okay, so what? So you're not going to eat fruits today? Well, we can survive a day without fruits. That's not a very the whole thing is you're doing this to convince either the moches, the tax collector, or whoever, the murderer, the robber. So that's not going to convince them. To which they answer, no. This is what we meant. Be'omer bilibo hayom, you say, the fruits of the world will be forbidden to me. And then in your mind, you say, right, your heart, which is really your mind, you say today without expressing it in words. And then motzi b'sfatav stam, but you really just continue, right? You just said fruits of the world will be forbidden on me, which sounds like forever, but you say to yourself today. To which the Gemara points out, now, normally this doesn't work when it comes to a neder, because things you say in your heart or things you have in your mind that you don't express are not considered anything. It's basically equal to nothing. Well, it's not exactly equal to nothing. If you're in a case where you're forced to lie, okay, where you're forced by someone, again, you're being forced to lie, but you're going to lose your possessions, to protect them from someone who's taking them unlawfully, right? Well, stress based on now the way we understand from the Gemara, someone's unlawfully trying to take something away from you. You're allowed to express things, leave out the important part, the word today, keep that in your mind, and with that, you can rely on it. Why is this? So it seems because it's obvious that that's not what you meant. In other words, it's clear that your intention, what you're thinking in your heart, seems to really be what you express, right? That your expression can be understood very clearly, that you're only saying it to get away from it, and therefore we're going to allow it in a case of onus. Okay. The commentary is all question. I'll just leave it as a question because the question is better than the answers. Why this isn't just a nidrei zeruzim, right? Where you were bargaining, right? And they try to distinguish how is this case different from nidrei zeruzim, because nidrei zeruzim would just not be a neder at all. This isn't a neder. This is a neder. It's just you have to do it in such a way where you say quietly in your head today, and out loud you make it seem like you're doing it for the long term, and that's how it would work. In nidrei zeruzim, where you were using it as bargaining, and you were just, no one ever thought you were saying what you said, what you meant. So that is just not a neder at all, and you're exempt without anything. So question is, why is this different? I'll leave that as a side question. Now we're going to go on. The first thing we're going to just do is quote the machloket Beit Shamai Beit Hillel in the three cases, or quote part of the three cases. Beit Shamai William Bakol, etc., which is Bakol Nedarim except for Shvua. That was machloket number one. Beit Shamai says you can even use an oath. Beit Shamai Omrim b'mashu mediro, and then they just skip to the last one. Only what they initiate. Really, they should have quoted. You'll see for the continuation. Beit Shamai says lo yiftach lo b'neder, you can initiate a neder, and Beit Hillel says you can. And b'mashu mediro, Beit Shamai Omrim only your neder is only invalid the part that they told you to do. Beit Hillel Omrim af b'sheino mediro, even if they didn't tell you to do a neder about that particular thing. Ketzad amar lekona mishti na'anetli v'amar kona mishti u'banai na'animli. If you added your sons or your daughters to the picture. Beit Shamai Omrim mishto muteret v'banav asurim. Beit Hillel Omrim ele v'ele mutarim. That's just a quote from the Mishna. Now we're going to bring a braita. And what they're going to do is bring this braita, which seems like it's talking about the same topic that we've been discussing, but yet it seems to contradict our Mishnah on 2 points. So, and then we'll have to resolve that, and we're going to resolve it in 2 different ways, and they're not only 2 different answers, but they're 2 different answers from a methodological perspective, like 2 types of different answers, 2 different types of answers. So we'll explain that in a minute. To which Rav Huna brings a braita. Tana, it says in a braita, Beit Shamai Omrim lo yiftach lo b'shvuah, which sounds like you can't initiate an oath. Beit Hillel Omrim af yiftach lo b'shvuah. You can even initiate an oath. Okay, so we assume that what's it's talking about. Again, we have a tax collector coming, let's say, and he said, give me this. And right away you said, I swear this is truma. So according to Beit Shammai, you can't do that. Only if he said, take an oath. After I said this is truma, and he says, I don't believe you, take an oath. And Beit Hillel says, af yiftach lo b'shvuah. You can even start by an oath. So now the Gemara has a big problem with this if you haven't figured it out yet. The Beit Shammai, number one, he says like this. Sounds like b'shvuah lo yiftach lo, ha b'neder yiftach lo. Since we already said shvuah is more severe than neder. So it sounds like you can open with a neder, just not a shvuah, because otherwise, if Beit Shammai wanted to say you can't even open with a neder, then we would have started with don't open with a neder. Kol shekain, obviously you would know from there a shvuah. So the fact that he said shvuah lo yiftach, it sounds like you could be potach with a neder. And that disagrees with Beit Shammai in our Mishnah. V'hatznan, Beit Shammai omrim lo yiftach lo b'neder. Beit Shammai says you can't initiate a vow. Only if they told you to take a vow can you do it. And a much more serious question is, or obvious question, the 2, miftachu de lo yiftach lo b'shvuah. Another inference is, it says don't initiate with a shvuah, which seems to imply But if they told you take an oath, you could take an oath. Now, what did Beit Shammai say in the Mishnah? Right? So again, miftachu de lo yiftach lo b'shvua, you can't initiate, but hameder nadar b'shvua, but you could take, okay, this is a strange language. It's the same language they use in the Mishnah, but you can take a neder, right? It sounds like you could take a vow in the language of a shvua. Okay, it's not really a vow. It's just saying you could take an oath. V'hatznan, but it says in the Mishnah, Beit Shammai amurim bakol nodrim chutz b'shvua. You can take you can use a vow for all this, but you can't use a shvua. So Beit Shammai's comment about lo yiftach lo b'shvua, which number one seems to indicate you could initiate with a neder, which is not what he says in the Mishnah, and it seems to imply you could take a shvua, right? And as long as they want you to take an oath, you can take an oath. And Beit Shammai said explicitly, you can't take an oath like this. So how do you explain this braita? So as I said, we're going to have two answers and two different types of answers. The first answer is, Tana matnitin b'neder. In other words, don't infer b'shvua lo yiftach lo b'shvua, but you can with a neder. No, lo yiftach lo b'shvua and lo yiftach lo b'neder. You can initiate a shvua or a neder. Now, why can't you initiate a shvua? Because you can't even take a shvua, okay? You can't initiate a neder because you can't take a neder, but you can initiate. That's Beit Shammai. So the question is, if it means both, and we drop our inference, then why did the Mishnah specifically say neder and the braita specifically said shvua in terms of lo yiftach? You can't initiate. So remember, there's a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. In both cases, Beit Hillel says it's okay. So we're now going to say that instead of saying they're close, they're two extreme positions. Beit Hillel says, not only are you allowed to take a shvua, but you can even initiate a shvua, okay? And obviously initiate a neder. Beit Shammai says, you can't take a shvua, even a neder, which you can take, you can't initiate. So they're both at opposite extremes. And each source focuses on one of the extremes. And that's why one is said by neder, one is said by shvua. So let's read. Tana manitim b'neder lo hodiacha kochan de Beit Shammai. The Mishnah chose the language of neder to say lo yiftach lo b'neder because they wanted to show that Beit Shammai goes to the extreme. They wanted to show you, even in neder where he allows it, he doesn't even allow you to initiate the neder. That you can take a vow, but you can't initiate. Tana braita b'shvua. Okay, the Tana of the braita though wanted to focus on shvua. Why? Lo diacha kochan de Beit Hillel, to show the other extreme, to show that even Beit Hillel, right? Beit Hillel goes to the extreme. Not only does he allow an oath, besides allowing an oath, he even allows you to initiate an oath. You can even right away from the beginning, they don't even ask you oath, vow, nothing. You can just initiate and say, I want to take an oath. So that's why each one focused on a different thing. So his answer is to keep the simple reading. Lo yiftach lo b'shvua is the same thing we're discussing in our Mishnah, lo yiftach lo b'neder. And to say they're just forget any inference. One is focusing on one wants to focus on the other opinion, and they're both stressing the extremes of either position. Right? Each one is stressing a different extreme. Rav Ashi has a totally different type of answer. Rav Ashi says, now this goes back to what I said earlier, that petach, until now we thought petach meant to undo, right, to dissolve by using a petach. Remember, there was petach and charata. There was either regret, which is charata, or petach, which is, had I known, I would never have done this. So comes Rav Ashi and says, you totally misread this Mishnah, this braita. Our Mishnah, when it said lo yiftach lo b'neder, it was talking about initiating, right, our case. But this braita, okay, Rav Ashi amar hach ketane, Beit Shammai omrim ein she'ela b'shvua, uBeit Hillel omrim yesh she'ela b'shvua. The whole question is, can you undo an oath in the same way you can undo a vow? And this braita has absolutely nothing to do. It might have the same wording, but petach there is not the same petach as by us. So his approach is to disconnect this entirely from our sugya and basically say, this has nothing to do with us at all. Petach is used in the typical way we use petach. Petach means, can you undo the oath using a petach? Can you say, oh, how'd I realize? Can you undo your oath at all, really, in general? Petach is kind of like a catchphrase for, can you undo? And the machloket is, Beit Shammai says, no way can you undo an oath. And Beit Hillel says, you can undo an oath. So we basically divorce this from our sugya because it has nothing to do with it. Okay, new Mishnah. The first part of this Mishnah we'll understand. The second part will be a little more complicated. We'll have to wait for the Gemara to explain. The Gemara is going to later explain that this is a Mishnah, and I'll already explain it now, is referring to there's a storm coming, Okay, you live in, I don't know, Florida, where there's a lot of hurricanes, and there's a huge hurricane coming, and you say, this is going to definitely wipe out my entire field. So you say the following: everything growing in my field, or these particular ones, whatever it is, will be a korban. Now, korban until now has meant vow, right? That they'll be forbidden to me. However, most people, most of the commentaries understand, not everybody, that what we mean by korban here means, and you'll see from the continuation, that I'm sanctifying it to the temple. Okay, and then we're going to get into laws of sanctification. So what you're basically saying, this is like Yaakov. Remember, he was worried something would happen to him, and he said, if everything goes well, I promise to God, I make a neder, right? I promise to God to bring the following. So, nitiyota elu korban. I will basically, if my field doesn't get destroyed by this hurricane, I commit all my field to God. Right to the temple. If they're not cut, meaning if they don't get destroyed, I'm offering them to God. Talit zo korban. This talit, this shirt or whatever, cloak, will be a korban. Talit doesn't mean the way we always refer to talit. A talit is a type of talit, or taliton, but it could be any kind of cloak or something covering. This will be korban if it's not burned. Okay, let's say there's a fire in my house, and I say, if that talit is saved, I will sanctify it to the temple. Yesh lahem pidyon. Okay, what the Mishna really means is, number one, they're sanctified. Number two, they can be redeemed. What does that mean? Well, what happens when something's sanctified? You redeem it generally. You don't bring that talit to the temple. What do? Right? The temple doesn't necessarily need your talit, or they don't need your fruits. You redeem them onto a coin. You financially say, this is worth X. I'm going to give that value to the temple. Then what happens? The money has sanctity. The object has no sanctity anymore, and you can use it. So that's what it's saying. Yesh lam pidyon. The Gemara is going to ask, why didn't it just say it's kadosh? And then we would have known yesh lam pidyon. It's a little bit strange. We'll get to that in the Gemara. Second case. This, everything that comes from this tree, okay, everything on this tree will be sanctified until they get cut off. Okay, once they're cut, they won't be sanctified anymore. It's a little bit of a strange thing. We'll get to this later. Talit zo korban ad shetisaref. This talit will be sanctified until it gets burned, which is very strange language, but we'll talk about that soon. Ein lahem pidyon. They can't be redeemed. What does that mean? We don't know yet. Okay, hold off. First thing the Gemara says is, as I said, it says in your text of ve'ein kedoshot, which really means, which is taken out by most of the commentaries, because the second is also kadosh. So you wouldn't say ein kedoshot, but what they're really saying is in the first part, we're now in Amud Bet, the first part should say they're sanctified, as I said when I read it, right? That's really what it's telling you. And then you would have known, yesh lahem pidyon. To which they say, even though we didn't really understand the end yet, but they're telling us, I did buy limit in a seifa, ein lahem pidyon, because the second part is supposed to say, it needs to say they can't be redeemed. Therefore, Tana Nami Reisha, this happens very often, literary structure of the Mishna. Therefore, in the Reisha, they said yesh lahem pidyon, which again means they are sanctified, but they can be redeemed. So we'll see in a minute why the seifa can't be redeemed, or 2 minutes. So the first thing they want to know is, Hechi nadar. How could you even take this kind of a neder? Because in the end, everything, right? What did you say? If einam niktzatzot in the first case. Now, every tree, everything that grows on every tree, eventually will be cut. Okay, either you'll cut them, or eventually the tree will die out and it will be cut. In other words, the future of every tree is that it'll eventually be cut. So what exactly is this neder? To which our Meimar says, Amar Meimar be'omer, im einam niktzatzot hayom, va'avar hayom v'lo niktzatzu. It must be that what you meant to say is, if they're not destroyed today, on that day the hurricane is coming, and the day passed and they weren't destroyed, then they become sanctified. To which the Gemara asks, in Ken Lamali Meimar, Pshita, I don't get it. That's totally obvious. The Mishnah doesn't need to tell us halacha. It's very obvious. If I say, right, that's like Yaakov's neder, right? You say, if I'm saved from this terrible hurricane and my crops are not destroyed, I'm going to sanctify them to the temple. Of course, they're sanctified. I don't need a Mishnah to explain that to me. To which the Gemara says, well, lo tzricha, this is really the case, and this is where we get the fact that it's a storm coming, and we'll see why it's not 100% clear. However, the Mishnah is telling us this is the halacha. You might not have been convinced until the Mishnah said so. There's a huge wind coming, or huge storm, This is already taught about a talit. Okay, we're going to see this kind of developing, the sentence is developing. Okay, we don't yet understand where they're going. Vitalit, first they're saying the wind is like the case of a talit. Let's understand the case of the talit, and then we'll apply it back to the wind. Vitalit, l'sreifa kaima. If I say, now, if we compare the trees to the talit, the trees will eventually be cut, right? Everything growing on this tree will eventually be cut off at some future point. The assumption is trees don't last forever, or fruits on the trees won't keep growing forever. The second thing is the case of the talit. Now, a talit, you say, until, right, if this is not burned. Now, a talit is not meant to be burned. Right? It's not like every talit stands to be burned eventually. No, not at all. So now they say, talit l'sreifa kaima, is it going to be burned? No. To which they say, well, we have to find a case where it is likely to be burned. What would that be? Kigon di'ika deleka. A fire was going on in your house. Hachanami di'ika zika nefisha. And that's why they're saying, just like there was a fire in your house and it was imminent danger, likewise here, your field, there was imminent danger of it being destroyed by some storm. Now, so what? Well, now, so again, you still promised it to the temple, so it's going to be promised. Well, you might have thought not. Why might you have thought not? Sal kadata. You might have thought, maybe you were just convinced. Okay? You're like impending doom. You know this is going to happen. You know your field's going to be destroyed. This hurricane is heading right toward you. You're so convinced that you make this ridiculous statement just to say how scared you are, right? And you say, wow, if these are saved, because there's no way they're going to be saved, I'm sanctifying them to God. But you didn't really mean to sanctify them to the temple. You were just saying, I'm sure that my field is going to be destroyed. I'm sure that my talit is going to be burned from this fire. And then, kamashmala, what it's coming to teach you is, no, we take your words seriously. You sanctified it. We don't say, again, this is all, when I said something, what did I mean? Did I mean it more like Yaakov, that I want to promise this to God in thanks because it was saved from being destroyed? Or was I just saying, I'm so convinced that this is the end? Okay, so comes to teach you, we're going with option A and not option B. Okay, we don't give you an out by saying, oh, I didn't really mean it. Next, now we have to understand, and this is what's left for today's daf, to understand that last line of the Mishna. So let's read it again inside the Mishna, and then we'll explain. That means as long as I haven't cut them, they will be sanctified. Once I cut them, right, it sounds like they won't be sanctified. So how exactly does this play itself out? Or talitzo korban ad shetisares. So look, the Gemara said, and then it says ein pidyon. They have no way to redeem them. To which the Gemara says, ula olam, you can never redeem them, right? Generally, sanctified items can be redeemed. So what do we mean here? Amar bar Pida. Interesting, his name is Pida, and he's talking about pidyon, okay, in pada. Okay, so I don't know if that's intentional. Sometimes the names connect with the machlokot they're known for. So bar Pada says, Pida'an, if you redeem them, okay, let's say they're attached to the ground. I have a fruit tree. Fruits are attached still. So what did I say? They're going to be sanctified as long as they're attached. So what do? I redeem them. I say, there's 20 apples on this tree. I'm going to now redeem them and take them, right? Take that value to the temple. I don't take them off my tree. They're still attached. So they still have they're still sanctified. So what happens? Normally when I redeem fruits that I sanctified, the fruits become chulin, permitted, and the money takes on the sanctity. In this case, pida'an chozrot vekodshot. What happens? I redeem them. So now they don't have sanctity. What's the problem? They're still on the tree. And I said, as long as they're still on the tree and they're not cut, they're sanctified. So I remove the kedusha, I put it onto coins. Those coins go to the temple. But then immediately they become sanctified again. And this keeps going on and on. Every time I redeem them, they immediately become sanctified again because they're still attached to the tree. And I said, as long as they're still attached to the tree, they're sanctified. That's what it means. Ein lahem pidyon. Pida'an chozrot vekodshot. So you keep doing this. As long as you keep redeeming them, they keep becoming sanctified again. Until what point? Sheyiktitzu, until you cut them. When you cut them off the tree, niktitzu, hodan pamachat v'dayo. Now he says something interesting, which is, okay, so these were sanctified because they were attached. Now, what did you say? they're going to be sanctified so long as they're attached. So every time you redeem them, they become sanctified again automatically a second later. But when do they lose their sanctity? When you cut them. What's the problem? Well, they were sanctified before you cut them, the minute before. So now that you cut them, you have to redeem them again because they have sanctity. And the only way to get rid of sanctity is to redeem them. And therefore, you redeem them one more time, and then you're done, because then they don't return to its sanctified state because they're already cut off. And you said they're only going to be sanctified as long as they're not cut off the tree. So that's barpada. Ula amal, kevan sheniktitzu shuv ein podan. Ula disagrees. Now, it's actually a debate which part he disagrees with. Does he disagree with the entire thing, that they don't become sanctified every time you do it? Or does he just agree with the last? Let's just go with the simple that he just agrees with the last point. He still thinks, Pada'an, Chojok, as long as they're on the tree, you redeem them, they keep getting sanctified. But once you cut them, they don't need pidyon anymore. You're done. It's not that you need to redeem them. I said very confidently a minute ago, well, of course, they're still sanctified. The only way to get rid of sanctity is to redeem them. So even though you cut them and they're no longer sanctified, they still have sanctity from before. And therefore, you need to redeem them one time, get rid of the sanctity, and it won't come back because now they're already detached from the ground. But Ula says, no. Since you said these are sanctified until I cut them, the moment you cut them, they're no longer sanctified. That here, because your statement was limiting the time frame or the in terms of actions, it's not really time, it's actions, that as soon as the action of cutting them happens and they're already detached from the tree, that already removes the sanctity and you don't need pidyon for that. Okay, so that's why I said maybe barpada, who requires more pidyon than, according to Ula, basically is maybe called barpada because of the pidyon, whereas Ula requires less pidyon. Some people think that Ula even disagrees with the first halacha, and that once you redeem it once, you don't need to redeem it another time. It's possible. There's a debate about that, but everyone clearly agrees that he disagrees on the second point for sure. This will finish for today. So again, what we did was in this Mishna, we tried to explain these nitzi, right? What's the difference between the two cases and why this one has pidyon and this one doesn't have pidyon and what exactly the situations are. Wishing you a good day, and we'll meet up again tomorrow.